Blair and Brown tried to do was to create, just like the French revolutionaries, that cold logic state.
Yes.
And it doesn't work. The Starmer's first reaction to any problem is to try to shut people up. We've, I think, been sold a complete pup on the idea of multiculturalism. It's a disaster. The idea in which actions do not have consequences is one without any kind of meaning whatever. Do you know what?
Yeah.
We do it shambolically. We never think it through. And everything that happened subsequent to 1948 has been a rather desperate attempt at tidying up some obvious loophole. So you have now this chaos, complete uncertainty about what the definition of citizenship is.
Hello and welcome to Catholic Unscripted. I'm Catherine Bennett.
And I'm Mark Lambert.
And we have conversations about the faith and the world through the lens of the Catholic faith. And we were very fortunate to speak today with Dr David Starkey, a name that will be very familiar to our British viewers, but not so familiar perhaps to other viewers across the world. So Mark, can you tell us a bit about who Dr David Starkey is?
Yeah, sure. So he's a very well-known figure in the UK. He's appeared on television and radio extensively. He was a fellow at Fitzwilmot College, Cambridge, where he lectured on Tudor history, and then moved to the London School of Economics, where he lectured on history there. So has an extensive academic background, but he really made his name on a famous radio show on radio, BBC Radio 4, called The Moral Maze, where he appeared regularly, engaging with people like Dr Roger Scruton, like famously built up this reputation for being quite acerbic in the way that he articulated his opinions. Now, I've been following Dr Starkey for a number of years, and we often share clips, don't we, and different things that he says. And the reason that I thought it was important to have this conversation is that he's perhaps the clearest voice, I think, today. He's coming from an academic background, who is able to diagnose the situation, really the global situation, Catherine. It's not just, but obviously very much from a UK perspective. But one of the things that we addressed in our conversation was the way that this is paralleled especially in the US. The same situation is very much mirrored in the two English-speaking countries. Why is that? What's going on? What is the answer to it? Most importantly, because there are lots of voices out there who are speaking to the situation, the socio-cultural situation, and just tearing it down and attacking it. Well, this conversation, I think, does much more than that. It diagnoses the problem, and then it provides some medicine. What do we need to do to build it back up again? Most interestingly, I think, for me, it feels like there's been a real change in the way that Catholics see themselves politically in the UK. We were very much part of that Irish diaspora, perhaps. That there was a real influx in our lifetime, Catherine and I's lifetime, when we were little children. We're sort of second generation Irish immigrants, with both of us with English fathers. So there was that mix of the two cultures. But that Irish diaspora was very much sort of had that social justice dimension to it, especially coming out of Vatican II, which meant that, I remember the priest preaching from the pulpit that everyone should vote for Labour. And this was a time when, Labour stood for something completely different. Now, Dr Starkey is able to he's got his own thesis about why we've ended up in the political situation that we've ended up in, what has actually happened to our political landscape, which he explains. He explains exactly the steps that perhaps people don't understand have gone on behind the scenes to lead us to the situation that we're in today. So there's that fantastic diagnosis, and I feel that he's reasoned his way to a Catholic position. You know, it's very much sort of a subsidiarity position, and he's got some great ideas which are very closely linked to biblical principles. Even though, you know, for years he was an atheist, and although he seems to be changing on that, a little softening, shall we say, a little bit on that now. I certainly wouldn't say that he's, you know, converted or anything like that, but a great mind and someone who's reasoned his way to a more Catholic position. So from that point of view, I thought it was you know, it's a really important conversation to have.
Yeah, so sit back, watch and enjoy, and do share your thoughts in the comments below. Also check out the notes to find ways to follow Dr. David Starkey with his own work, and let us know what you think. Please visit our website, catholicunscripted.com. Hello and welcome to Catholic Unscripted. I'm Catherine Bennett.
And I'm Mark Lambert.
And we're delighted to be joined today by Dr. David Starkey. You're very welcome.
Thank you.
There's so much we'd like to talk with you about, David. Time is short, but we're going to launch straight in with the first question. You've long argued that history is not an ornament of national life, but one of the conditions that makes a civilization intelligible to itself. Has modern Britain, in your view, lost that historical self-understanding? And if so, what follows from that loss?
What do we mean by Britain? Do we mean the people who inhabit Britain? A great many of them haven't. There's still profound interest. Look at the visits to museums, look at the visits to art galleries, to historic houses, the passion of local history societies. What I think has happened is something different. There has been an official disowning of memory. I think this is the fundamental problem that we had, and I think it's important that I put my cards on the table straight away. I think there was a deliberate attempt at making Britain, England, and remember the core. Okay, you're Irish Catholic, but the core of Britain is England, is this extraordinary long political experience of, I think it's a society which is unique in its fundamental continuity, or rather was. In other words, yes, the Japanese the house of the Japanese emperor goes back further than our royal family, but the ruptures in how Japan has governed itself, particularly in the last 100 years, are huge. Whereas we genuinely do have, or did have, a political system that was itself memory. That was it, in other words, an unwritten constitution doesn't mean there isn't one. It means it's an exercise of cumulative memory and adjustment, and the past speaking to the present and talking into the future, to use the language of another very great Irishman, or Anglo-Irishman, Edmund Burke, though obviously not a Roman Catholic. What happened, however, deliberately in 1997, we had a prime minister and we had a chancellor of the exchequer and we had a government that decided, rather than being a very old and very peculiar, and I use that word in the good sense of the word, not bad, I'm peculiar, and most interesting people are, most interesting countries are, but rather than an old peculiar country, Blair wanted to make us a new typical. And do you know what? He largely succeeded. One of the central things that involved was a conscious act of historical amnesia. But it's worse than amnesia. The official reaction to our history is not only isn't it anything to be very proud about, it is actually something to be usually very ashamed about. And it's this. It seems to me that in the same way with a human being, as we know, the loss of memory is the most terrible symptom of Alzheimer's. We've had a kind of induced national Alzheimer's. And in the same way that loss of memory in a human being produces overall dysfunction, which it does, I've watched it, you will have watched it, it is a most terrible thing to see. It has done the national Alzheimer's visited on us, deliberately injected into us by New Labour. That neophilia, that worship of everything new, has had precisely the same consequences. So we have, on the one hand, a country where history is visible, where it's tactile. You see it, you smell it, don't you? It's everywhere. Where am I now? I'm 100 yards south of the British Museum. A few steps from me, I am in perfect 18th century townscapes. It's all there. A few going up, that's going in that direction, to the museum itself. I have the treasures not simply of our history, but world history. But, the official language, the official behavior has amounted to, I've talked about the need for a great restoration. I think I will now coin a new phrase. The Blair government was the great repudiation.
Absolutely. Blair was an extraordinary individual, though, wasn't he? Like, I don't think we.
You lot have got to own him. Yes.
You heard it here first.
But there's a documentary on the Blair years on Channel 4, I think, at the moment. I don't know if you've managed to watch it, but
it's very feeble. It's
right.
Very feeble. It doesn't. It's purely at the superficial level of personalities and whatever. It doesn't. Again, it was very easy not to take Blair seriously. Do you remember he was first known as Bambi? This rather fey, all the rumors about his sexuality and whatever, this rather fey creature prancing around. Or there was a wonderful, wonderful Peter Brooks cartoon that showed him as the monkey to Alistair Campbell's organ grinder. But there's a measure of truth in that too. But Blair was the front, at any rate. I suspect the brains were really Gordon Brown. Mandelson and Campbell provide the machinery of state-sanctioned lies. It's the moment with Campbell that you actually turn lying into the fundamental principle of political management. We can say this without any fear of libel. Remember, there is that book written by Peter Oborne, who himself has now gone mad, but that's another matter. He wasn't then, called The Rise of Political Lying, and it's a study in Alistair Campbell. And it pins on Campbell, I think it's 8 explicit lies. And Oborne was never sued. Campbell, of course, lies that he's never read the book. So we can quite safely talk about the art of lying. But behind all of that, there was a genuine intelligence. It was a perverted intelligence, which, as I said, contrived really pretty much to undo 800 years. In one sense, it's a jolly big achievement. But of course, it's led us to this extraordinary situation that we're in now, that as a central aspect of all of that was to try to make us like a European country, particularly Germany, or at least symbolically like a newly enfranchised minor former Soviet republic, something like that. But what it did was to stand our political system on its head. We were the most intensely political of countries. The constitution was shaped by the current majority in Parliament. And that was, of course, something that Blair could not tolerate, Brown could not tolerate. There's that profound distrust of the left, and this collection in particular, with popular opinion. They affect to be, of course, the voice of democracy, but they know their opinions, their elite, very elite opinions, are simply not shared by the majority. So what they did was, and it was extraordinarily clever, was to, okay, we're in power now, accidents, circumstances have given us this enormous majority, we will make it permanent by making sure that any future election will not fundamentally change the essence of how we're governed, because we're going to take power away from elected officers, we're going to give it to experts, the bodies who run the quangos, the quasi-autonomous non-governmental organizations, of which there are 444, completely controlling deliberately, without any form of accountability. They're designed not to be accountable, controlling roughly a third of state expenditure. And then on the other hand, you alter the relationship of law and politics. That the traditional behavior of the common law judge was to interpret the law rigorously and minutely, and not to engage in abstract speculation and to defer to the authority of Parliament. What happened was a complete reversal of that relationship. So you now have a new principle introduced into our constitution, which is called the rule of law. And I will say, of course, it's not new. It just means procedure. Well, that's what it used to mean, proper procedure. Instead, it's been elevated into a co-equal principle that is somehow perceived by judges, whereas we always used to think that the final arbiter of our political system was the majority produced by a general election. It isn't anymore. It's a kind of new body of what are seen as fundamental laws, the European Convention, the Equality Act, and so on, all of which are, again, this is barely sayable, but it needs to be said, are consciously and deliberately anti-democratic. And I'm not visiting this interpretation. This is, in fact, I'm quoting from the man who played the most important part alongside the political establishment. There was a major shift in the legal establishment at the same time, and the rise to intellectual prominence, and indeed judicial prominence, of a judge called Tom Bingham, Lord Bingham. And it's Bingham who is the one that provides the legal heft that goes alongside the political and intellectual heft of Gordon Brown and Blair. And it's Bingham who was the great pusher of the idea of the Supreme Court, which tells you itself what his view of law was. But also, he is the one who effectively, alongside the legislation of 1997-98 incorporating the European Convention, he is the one who rewrites the idea of the rule of law from being procedural to substantial. And he includes human rights law as a fundamental part of common law, rather than a wildly separate continental French tradition, which of course is what it is. And he also, and this is, we are reaping the consequences now, similarly incorporates, without any shred of legislative authority, at least Parliament had said it wanted a version, it wanted human rights law incorporated in a rather conditional way into English common law. But what Bingham does is to go infinitely further. He incorporates international law, which is why we're having the Chagos Islands, which is why you have this ludicrous Attorney General, which is why we have a politics in which the thing that matters least is Britain's national interests. We've sort of turned these things inside out. But to go back to Bingham's comment, which is the one that I think underscores everything, and it's interesting, he made it in Australia. Was it alcohol that loosened his tongue, as it frequently does to people in Australia? Was it a sense of the safety of difference? But in a lecture in Australia, shortly after he'd published that book, he says the following, and I'm quoting: "Human rights law, by definition, is anti-democratic. It's counter-majoritarian, and it prioritizes the minority against the majority." And then he goes on and he lists the minorities, beginning with the mentally sick. You know, there's no accident about Kalokane. You know, the inquiry is taking place at the moment. The extraordinary kid gloves, the refusal to do the obvious thing. This man was clearly a danger to himself and a danger, particularly, and all I care about, a danger to others. And it was obvious from the age of about 13. Was he ever locked up? Was he ever seriously restrained? No. Because we've got to understand. You know, and this is, again, when people complain, you know, that they are second-class citizens in their own country, and that's the intention of it. You prioritize the minority against the majority. In other words, you literally, this again is not simply the abolition of history. You invert the meaning of words. The democracy means very simply the rule of the majority, but no, liberal democracy means the opposite. In fact, to parody Voltaire on the Holy Roman Empire, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Liberal democracy is neither liberal nor democratic. It's the opposite. It's what you do. You put the majority in leading strings. You literally handcuff them with law and with regulation in order to protect minorities. So you literally have acknowledged two-tier justice. It's not an accident of some funny, silly judge. It's actually written into our law. This is a mess we've got ourselves into.
Yeah, this is the constitutional shift. I think it's so important, this part of your thesis, that people don't really understand what's going on. And it's a great service to the country that you're able to explain it in this way. So, but what is the motivation, do you think, David? I know it's crazy, isn't it? But they seem to be deliberately undermining parliamentary sovereignty.
Totally.
That's what they've done. Do they mean to do that? Is it a deliberate thing?
Oh, absolutely. No.
Why?
Right, think about it. What has happened is that you now have a very, I made the point at the beginning that when I said, has there been a loss of you asked me, has there been a loss of historic memory? And I distinguished between the elite that rulers deliberately suppressing it, perverting it, denouncing it, and the overwhelming majority of the country who love it, enjoy it, live in it, wish to preserve it, conserve it, work as volunteers, are passionate amateurs about it. What's happened is there's this enormous divide between elite opinion and that of the vast majority of the population. It's analyzed brilliantly by a man called David Goodhart, and he labels the two groups, the elite, the anywheres. They don't believe in the nation. They believe in global welfare, and it's and the somewheres, that's the rest of us who are rooted here, are creatures of our language, our time, our country, and believe in that. Because what's happened, Mark, is that, and again, Catholicism is interesting on this point. Catholicism is essentially a universalist religion. That's the universal church, and the role of the Pope is as a universalist, as the priest of the world, if you like, orbi et orbi, right?
Yeah.
The greeting. So one can understand what has happened, I think, is that from particularly in 1945, and it's understandable why it happened. In 1945, remember, you're at the end of a second terrible war that has been fought within a gap of only 20 years. We forget this, It's 1939 back to 1918 is 21 years.
Yeah.
The peace treaties that settled the First World War were barely dry when the second one breaks out. And what you do is you blame nations. You believe you see nationalism gone mad in the world of fascist Germany and fascist Italy. And what you try to do is to set up a series of international institutions, the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, the Human Rights Commission, all of that stuff. And what's extraordinary, if you read, which I have done as part of the work that I'm doing on my big idea of conservatism and the Constitution. If you read leading conservative thinkers writing in the 1940s, you will find astonishing things like, we do of course accept the principle of world government. From somebody like Quentin Hogg. So you can see where it all comes from.
Yeah.
But what's happened is it perverted itself, because of course you create this wonderful international paradise, but just like the Garden of Eden in Genesis, there is a serpent the serpent is called the Soviet Union, that right from the beginning, because of course it's the leading wartime ally, and perverts the system from inside. You're turning the West's openness against itself. The Soviet Union spotted instantly. How do you undercut it? Well, you look at the issues, slavery. That's how you sort America out. How do you undo Britain? Well, you undo Britain by a charge of imperialism. And then how do you undo both Britain and the United States? Racism.
Yeah.
And how do you undo everybody who's not communist? Fascism. So the whole language of the new left is filtered through. Now, what were the motives? You asked me, what did they think they were doing? They thought that they were creating a new, better world of universal values, as opposed to particular narrow local values that are local and historically rooted. That's what they thought they were doing. It is actually on record in that book that I mentioned, the David Goodhart book. He describes the conversation, needless to say, at an Oxford high table between himself and the former Permanent Secretary of the Treasury, Gus O'Donnell, and the then director of the BBC, now the director of CNN, Mark Thompson, in which Gus O'Donnell said quite simply, what's this business about national interest, national well-being? I didn't see that as my function. My function was the well-being of the world.
So,
but think about it, Mark. And again, it's much of this is, of course, and we're now coming quite close. I'm coming quite close. Much of this is perverted Christianity.
Yes.
It's Corinthians 14. It's that in God there is neither Jew nor Gentile, nor bond nor slave. But that, of course, is in God.
Exactly.
That's in eternity. St. Paul says absolutely nothing about abolishing slavery. On the contrary, as you know, he says slaves should behave well to their masters and their masters should behave well to slaves. So what we've tried to do is to bring the millennium down to earth, and rather than as a result of religious belief and passion, turn it into the consequence of political action. And at that point, of course, the utopia turns into a nightmare as the attempt at producing, because we're, again, the proper Catholic perception. You talk about original sin. I see something different, but it amounts to the same thing. Human beings are just flawed. The idea of perfection and human beings doesn't go together. And trying to produce perfect social systems, starting from scratch, as with the French Revolution, which is the ultimate model for the behavior of Blair and Brown, invariably ends in disaster. And seeking to make perfect, you make monstrously worse.
Yeah. And this is what Pope Benedict XVI wrote brilliantly about in his books, in his series of books, Jesus of Nazareth. And there's a particular chapter on the temptations of our Lord. And he holds up
the worldly dominion,
and he holds up the figure of Barabbas and as a sort of alter ego to Jesus, and says the people called for Barabbas. So that I mean, we'd look at it with a spiritual lens, that it is that trying to establish what can only be held in unity, that diversity that can only be held in unity under Christ. And we see all around us, and you've spoken about it brilliantly there, David, the consequences of that. And what we seem to see is this dissolution of Parliament into NGOs whose power and influence is designed to survive elections. So it doesn't matter, and people see it doesn't matter, and so they sort of lost a sense of voting for something they believe in, and every vote is just a not that.
Yeah, and well, I mean, look at the last election, in which you deliver one of the largest parliamentary majorities ever on the basis of 1 in 5 voters.
Yeah.
That Labour got roughly a third of the actual votes, but in fact only 2/3 of people voted. So one of the in fact less, about 60%, one of the lowest turnouts has ever been in a general election, for the simple reason that people see. Again, look at the sort of popular phrases like, "Oh, they're all the same." Well, the problem is they really did become the same.
Yeah.
Cameron and May disastrously, in particular, buy into all of this stuff. So extraordinarily did Boris Johnson. The only Tory who visibly dissented was one who, gives good ideas a bad name, poor old Liz Truss. But you had again the standard terms of abuse of the internet. You had a uniparty. It really, if you look at Britain in 2024 and compare it with 2010, you would have thought there'd been simply a continuous government. There's no break in 2010. And we've been there before. It is also a great problem, with conservatism itself. Conservatism itself is a very thing. There's that wonderful story of Margaret Thatcher marching into the Conservative Research Department, which was, of course, run by that snake, the snake in the grass, Chris Patten, her deep and secret opponent, and slamming down Friedrich von Hayek's Constitution of Liberty. This is what we believe in. Obviously, she'd never quite got to the end of it, because the last chapter is called "Why I Am Not a Conservative." And I've tried to explore this because, of course, remember, the Conservative Party is founded in defeat. It's invented, literally invented, the word is invented in the middle of the 1830s, 1834, 35, by Sir Robert Peel in the Tamworth Manifesto, which accepts the Great Reform Act of 1832. Now, the Great Reform Act of 1832, and of course, Catholic emancipation a couple of years beforehand, destroy the old Tory party. The Tory party had believed in the Constitution and the Church, the Church of England, the exclusive right of the Church of England to be the established church, and that everybody had to belong to that church, not to avoid persecution, but to take part in public life. And that goes in 1829-30 with Catholic emancipation. And then in 1832, you sweep away the basis of the old corruption, the Constitution, which had served very well the extraordinary period of Britain's vast imperial and commercial development, and managed by Robert Walpole on the system of old corruption. All that swept away. And the great problem was, having accepted that change, which is also a very good thing, because if you look across the channel, what we call conservative parties are actually reactionary parties. They're wanting to overthrow the French Revolution. They're wanting to go back in time. And the Conservative Party in Britain accepted that fundamental change, which, remember, 1832 was a moment of terrible peril. If the king had done whatever William IV had done, what everybody thought he would, and resist the movement to reform, it would almost certainly have led to an 1830 style revolution in Britain. I mean, it's a moment. So, in other words, it's 1832 and the Tamworth Manifesto. On the one hand, is an absolutely typical moment in, I would call it, Anglo-British history, in which we do contrive to pour new wine into old bottles without the bottles bursting. The old idea, which is the foundation idea of Parliament, that everybody is there, in 1832, begins to be translated from a legal fiction into an actual fact by the broadening of the franchise, ending up finally with the enfranchisement of women at the beginning, immediately after the First World War. So it's a good thing. But on the other hand, once you accept change, where do you stop?
Well,
And
quite.
the only one, and again, one of the people that I'm trying to revive interest in is Disraeli. Disraeli is by far the greatest leader of the Conservative Party, not the greatest Conservative Prime Minister. And you know what? In the 1860s, he identifies the problem in exactly the way that I've tried to do with what Blair did. Listen, this is what he actually says. in 1867, after he's broadened the franchise to include my ancestors, because I always point out my father was a tool maker. He did a very much better job than somebody else's father, but there we are. But I come from the old skilled working class.
Yeah.
In cotton and the engineering that was associated in cotton in the north of Manchester, in Oldham, Rochdale, and around there. But Disraeli defends this enormous change, which, remember, the enfranchisement of the skilled working class is the thing that opens the way to conservative dominance of politics, because, you know, as Disraeli understood, the broad mass of the people are pretty conservative on all what you could call cultural lines. Anyway, what Disraeli says is this, and it's really interesting to look at it, and also to look at how the quotation has been edited. He says, but remember, I always make a joke of this, and it is worth repeating. Disraeli is giving a speech of roughly 2 hours in length, in some vast room, no public, remember, there's no amplification. You have shouters in the crowd that sort of pass them. You can imagine the hubbub that goes on. And I have here, which I haven't even sipped, this genuine is water. I have one little glass of water. Disraeli gets through these things with 2 bottles of brandy. You know, how but anyway, he remains astonishingly coherent. But this is what he says, and listen carefully. In a progressive country, and I think this is the key thing to understand, Anglo-Britain, England-Britain, is the world's most progressive country. We invent the future here. The idea of a nationwide representative government is novel. The world that emerges in the late 17th century, the new sciences of Isaac Newton, the new commerce and financial management of the Bank of England, and also Newton, who actually sorts out the currency and so on. That extraordinary explosion of the mind. We all think of the Enlightenment as French. It's not. It's British. It begins here, and then it's picked up in Scotland. Once you break the Presbyterian monopoly in Scotland, and that again extraordinary flowering there. So he begins in a progressive country. He says change is inevitable. And the Oxford English Dictionary stops the quote there. In other words, you turn Disraeli into David Cameron. Oh, you know, all liberal, let it all hang out. You know, we want a conservative party where liberals will feel entirely at home, and my greatest achievement is gay marriage, you know, all of that stuff. But that's not what Disraeli says at all. He then goes on and says, the question is not will there be change, but what sort of change? Is it change in accordance with the traditions and customs of the country? Good. Is it change, and listen, this is astonishing, 1867, is it change in accordance with the abstract principles of international liberalism and cosmopolitanism? Bad. 1860, that's exactly
where we are.
Exactly where we are.
Yeah.
And what I think you can see is that what happens in the 20th century, particularly with the 1909 budget, the Parliament Act, the rise of the Labour Party, is narrow economic issues become prominent and displace that. But underlying it, that is the historic great dispute. Are you a nation or are you general humanity? And if you bother to think about it, particularly the Human Rights Act is, again, it's an attempt at turning Corinthians 14 into legislative form. And if you think about it, if you believe that there are universal human rights, you believe there's a universal human being.
Yeah.
In other words, the state becomes not the demos, not the source of the people, not the source of historical tradition. The state just becomes an obstacle. It shouldn't be there. There shouldn't be frontiers. We're all the same.
Boundaries. It's it becomes about borders and breaking through borders, because
there shouldn't be borders.
Yeah.
You see, if you look, I mean, again, one of the really interesting things that's happened, I think, is the Labour Party, of course, has tended deliberately to obscure all of this, loads and loads of guff. But if you actually look at the Greens under their new, amazing, messianic leader, the chap who literally charismatic, persuading ladies that if they think about it enough, they can go from a size A to a size D. But if you look at what they're actually saying, the Green policy on immigration explicitly says there should be no frontiers. There should be no difference between the immigrant and the native. And this is what we're up against.
So we'd say
this is human rights uncoupled from, I would say, uncoupled from natural rights, and a recognition of, you said, if there are human rights, there's a human being, but also I'd say if there are such things as human rights, and I think there's an overemphasis on rights, in fact, there is a human rights giver. And I think this uncoupling ignores the fact that a nation is born out of families, that it is not this homogenous whole without borders, and that's not how it was ever understood.
We have to have shared ideals, don't we? That is
I think yes, there are some shared ideals, but remember, the most striking thing about Britain, we also invented the idea of His Majesty's loyal opposition. We invented the idea that there isn't a single answer, that you can be loyal and you can disagree. And you see, I think this is the really important thing, that what held us together was a series of really extraordinary balancing acts that you recognized that there are, in fact, the whole basis of my view of the world, that no question is finally settled, that there are several, not simply two sides, there are usually several sides to the question. But what you have to do is to create it's the equivalent of boxing. You've got to have a ring, a referee, you've got to have rules that enables this conflict. It is conflict. To be conducted peacefully. And that was that's the enormous achievement. This is why it's why I talk about, yes, the great repeal, sweep away the Blairite stuff, but I want a restoration. I don't want a revolution. Revolutions are terrible, awful things. And those who throw the word around, I think, are criminally irresponsible. You look at no real revolution has ever achieved anything apart from destruction.
No.
What it invariably does is to perpetuate the worst features of the ancien regime. The American Revolution succeeds because it's not a real revolution; it's a rebellion. It's you keep the existing structures of law, most of the existing structures of property. There's already an entire immersion of the colonists. Each colony had already a constitution. Most of them had a deliberate echo of the structures of the English Parliament. Of course they would. That's what they come from, and so that's why it succeeds. Whereas the French Revolution, literally, like Blair, wants to start from scratch and does it, as you know, the principal victim is one of the principal victims is the Catholic Church and the horrors.
Well, it can't be done without that reign of terror.
That's right. But also remember, one of the central things was, and if again, what I think may be surprising some people is our very broad agreement, because of course I would have once have confidently described myself as atheist. I'm a little less confident now about what I don't believe in, to put it like that. But it seems to me, the essential understanding where we agree, as I said, is on that notion of human imperfection. And the thing that I think brings home
I think we agree on that.
Indeed, but that's once you agree on that,
yes,
all sorts of other things follow. But equally, if we look at what I think is the key act of the French Revolution, yes, of course, the terror, yes, the horror of the noyade, all of that stuff. But it's that moment of the feast of reason. in which, in the secularized Notre Dame, you have, half-naked actress from the Comédie Française impersonating reason, sprawling on the high altar. Now, that's the obscenity of the thing, in which you give human reason a kind of wholly false. I mean, I believe in human reason, but it's an imperfect thing. But if you turn it into a new God, that's what happens.
Very well put there. We speak often, don't we, Mark? We're children of the 70s, 80s, in our 50s now.
Oh, you're children, my
We're children, David. We're mere children. But
in comparison with this decrepit monument, yes.
Hardly, but full of wisdom. For many decades, we've recognised that growing up, Catholics and Irish descended working class communities in England often found a political home in Labour. Because it seemed to speak the language of solidarity, duty, common life. But we've spoken a bit about the Conservatives. Does Labour have a future as it abandons the white working class and the unions who founded it? Because we've seen that shift, and you've spoken about the Blair Brown years, and with Mandelson as the key architect. That shift away from the TUC towards lobbyists. And with that, this permanent state of the elites in power. Labour are pretty much done for, aren't they, with the working class?
I think that's largely true, despite the extraordinary gyrations of Angela Rayner. But you see, remember, Labour always was, the party always was, a bizarre alliance, an electoral coalition between the solid working class and the trade unionists, the kind of people who are archetypically represented by Ernest Bevin. And Bevin, the former Secretary of the Transport and General Workers, the probably our greatest certainly the greatest foreign secretary of the 20th century, the man who is responsible for our nuclear deterrent and whatever. But also, it was in alliance with the progressive, extremely progressive middle class. That is what Labour was. And if you want the tensions there, go and look at George Orwell. George Orwell, in his wonderful essay, The Lion and the Unicorn, looks at exactly that. And he gives this description of the typical Labour Party member, and it goes as follows, something like, I'm misquoting it, Quaker, sandal-wearing, vegetarian, gay, and then he has this moment, he's really pretty anti-homosexual, he has this wonderful moment in which he describes a gay couple on the bus, and it's one of the, Orwell has more ability to conjure disgust in prose than almost anybody else. I don't know whether you've read again his great essay on being down and out in Paris when he was in hospital, and they carried out bloodletting, phlebotomy by means of cupping, which utterly description, it turns your stomach. But so does the description of these two sort of lefty gays wearing matching pistachio shorts, stretched so tightly that every dimple in their ample backsides was publicly visible. And again, if you look at, it's wonderful, isn't it? If you look at, all the saints are pretty good at that sense of being repelled by the fleshly, one side of the fleshly nature of human beings. But if you also look in 1984, the party consists of the middle class. And the typical, the party members, they're caricatures, they're the school teacher, they're the librarian. And what happened is that with the decline of heavy industry, with the Thatcher's destruction of it, and the corresponding decline of trade unionism in everything but the state sector, all that goes. So it leaves just the middle class, and of course the newly trade unionized middle class. The again extraordinary behaviour of the doctors, behaving in a fashion that makes the London dockers look morally responsible. Isn't it true?
Yes. Yeah.
absolutely.
Isn't it absolutely true? So again, so even the trade union movement has been reabsorbed back into this state machinery. So the Labour is the party of the anywheres. Labour is the party of the more highly educated, those who believe in this international world, those who see the ideas of patriotism, the state, history as fetters of the past, things to be struck off.
Yeah, and for whom many of the real issues affecting the daily lives of others don't touch them.
Because they're rich enough to be able to avoid them.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, that again, remember, there are very powerful parallels with what's happening in America with the Democrats. There's a very, very similar process. And again, the shift in voting patterns, which state is red, which state is blue, again, the whole collapse of the red wall, and so on and so on and so on. What is now astonishing is that many of the last redoubts of liberal leftism, remember the Liberal Party under Ed Davey, in many ways is even more lunatically left than the Greens, are in some of the richest areas of the country, where you can engage safely in rural fantasies. Yes. You won't go into too many details, as this has a general viewership, but
So we see that, like, we've diagnosed this globalism as perhaps the reason why we see this occurring all around Europe and in the States. And when we talk about migration, and how do we push back against that, David? Like, what's, this is the diagnosis. What's the medicine? What would you say? What's our intellectual armory, and how do we push back and say that we need to enforce borders?
Well, I think that the position is simple, that a state that can't defend its borders isn't a state at all. I mean, the trouble is, of course, as we can now see from the brutal exposure of our weakness. You remember Warren Buffett, the great financier, the outstanding investor of the later 20th, early 21st century, always had this phrase that, when the tide goes out, you can see who isn't wearing bathing trunks. Well, the Gulf War was the tide going out, and our nakedness to our enemies. The astonishing fact, we spend more on defense than Israel, and we have virtually nothing for it. And it's characteristic of this deliberate denuding of the state, of its deliberate defenselessness. How do we sort the problem out? Well, clearly, there has to be that recovery of confidence in the state, in its borders, a proper definition of citizenship. Remember, again, we never did this properly. As the empire expanded, everybody in the empire was a subject of the crown. And being a subject of the crown we didn't have citizenship. We were subjects of the crown. And then in 1948, particularly with India, the jewel in the crown of empire, becoming independent, to begin the process of rethinking that. But you know what? We do it shambolically. We never think it through. And everything that happened subsequent to 1948 has been a rather desperate attempt at tidying up some obvious loophole. So you have now this chaos, complete uncertainty about what the definition of citizenship is. Again, I think that we need a really serious rethink of law. I mean, look at the case of that extraordinary Egyptian activist, Ali Al-Fatah, who just before Christmas, there was this enormous hoo-ha about the fact that he was a British citizen, Civis Britannicus sum, must be defended, when in fact he was a product of two total accidents. The fact that his mother had lived here for two years from birth to two, and the fact that he had been born, I think in 1980, he'd been born a year later, the fact that he'd inherited from his citizenship from his mother wouldn't have applied. So just what two total accidents of somebody with no contact here. The left claiming just as British as you and me, and in the same way that that Ruda Cabana, was a good Welsh boy, wasn't he? This ludicrous nonsense. But what I think, so we need a proper definition. But the other thing that we need is, we've been talking about our weaknesses, Mark. I think we should also be talking about our strengths. One of the things that is remarkable about that history that I was discussing, I think it's capable of constant renewal. It's shown that it is. And I think what we should do is look at the fact that we are a unique country. Blair didn't want us to be. Brown didn't want us to be. Brown tries to invent this idea of Britishness, but there is no British nation. We're Scots, we're English, we're Irish. You say quite explicitly Irish Catholic origins. But what held us all together? Well, what held us together was what I was talking about, this constitution, this primarily a creation of English history, but one in which all the constituents of the United Kingdom more or less successfully took part. That invention of a world in which things were solved by debate, not by fighting. In which we recognized that there were rival visions of the good, rival visions of the common good, that we didn't, therefore, try to shut up people who disagreed with us. They were allowed to argue their case, or all of that sort of thing. But you see, what I think that means is, and I'm floating this idea with you. I've become very confident about the idea of the Great Repeal. This is a new idea. We've, I think, been sold a complete pup on the idea of multiculturalism. It's a disaster. The idea all cultures are equal is just silly, and it makes for an entirely incoherent public sphere, totally incoherent public sphere. Because in the same way, if you say that, then the only British values can be tolerance, can be diversity. In other words, nothing. Because that's what it amounts to. And not even, as I described it before, you have a boxing match with no rules and no referee. What I think we need to recognize is that we're essentially a culture of biculturalism. That's to say, we are a series of hyphenated identities. British-Irish, British Scots, Anglo-Scot. I'm obviously an Anglo-Brit. And all the successful immigrants groups function like that. And the example I always give was my very odd, edgy friendship forged through our joint appearance on the Moral Maze in the 1990s with Hugo Gryn, the rabbi of the West End Reform congregation. Congregation's the wrong word, Reform Synagogue, Jewish Reform Synagogue. And, Hugo and I had a very edgy relationship, best, I think, as always, illustrated by a joke. Hugo was, one of these things I always say accounts for the fact chaps get prostate problems, when you vibrate down there so much. Anyway, David, you're not half as nasty as you seem. And I then replied, deliberately pitching my voice higher, and you, Hugo, aren't as nice either. But you know what? Despite all of that, and I've never forgotten it. And yesterday I talked about it with, indeed, haven't I become religious, with an Israeli, with a Jewish podcaster. Terrific time. I was very impressed by it. But he did something extraordinary. He invited me, and my late gay partner, of course, to a Passover in his house. I've never forgotten it. Completely extraordinary. This man, that I just saw as yet another figure in the great charivari of the media, suddenly became a priest, high priest in his own household. It was staggering. Yeah. But that's what I mean by the biculturalism. And Hindus, Sikhs, all of very, very successful. Chinese, particularly the Hong Kong Chinese, we know a couple of groups haven't.
But we noticed that those people, like even our immigrant friends, you know, the people like from different cultures, from the Commonwealth, if you like, who've come to live in the UK, are proud of England. You know, like there seems to be
many
a real,
of the well, some are, some aren't. I mean, again, the great problem with it was a Commonwealth country, part of the Raj, Pakistan, you know, carved out of it. Unfortunately, largely we imported the poorest, the most primitive, and the most backward. I mean, let's call things by their proper names. Clans of the edges of the Punjab, the foothills of the Punjab, and it has been utterly disastrous. And again, you know, we also need to think much more clearly. Very remarkable work is being done on why these groups are unassimilable, why almost certainly Afghanis will turn out to be the same thing. The fundamental problem is tribalism. If you have tribalism based on cousin marriage and clan structures and whatever, it's completely opposed to the essentially our notions of individual responsibility, individual legal responsibility, individual responsibilities at law, the fact that we vote as individuals, not as family groups and whatever. All of this is now being openly recognized, thanks particularly to the work of a remarkable legal historian, a man called Patrick Nash. But in some ways, it's too late. And we've also got to ask, I think, both of you, why, after all, we've had this immigration now for nearly 60 years, why we're only suddenly really wakening up? And this, I think, again goes back. I've been making a great play with What's Wrong with Blair in 1997. But in this area, the problem is much older. The problem goes right back to the first, particularly Caribbean, black wave of immigration after the Second World War, the tensions which naturally arose, and the solution that was adopted to those tensions, which was unfortunately in the 1968 Race Relations Act, and you know, the famous response also to that act in Enoch Powell's speech, the decision was taken, we would shut down discussion. That talking about race was effectively made unmentionable. It was like discussing sexual perversion in public. And the result is, you know, if you stop people talking about a problem, it doesn't go away.
It goes underground.
It suppurates. Well, but it not simply goes underground, Mark. It suppurates. It's like an untreated, uncleansed wound. This is why I've fallen victim on the questions of speaking too bluntly. My dear old mother, again, always said, your tongue will be the ruin of you. She was right and wrong, wasn't it? It was both the making of me and temporarily the undoing of me. But the point is, freedom of speech isn't just a nice thing. It is genuinely it is the only way difficult things can be solved. There's no other way you can do it. Well, you may think you can do it by the wisdom of the experts, but then that involves the Chinese way. It involves, okay, one person takes the decision, but then everybody else has got to be throttled and forced to abide by it.
Well, I think the church has reneged somewhat on her responsibility in speaking to this, and I think this is not unconnected to what we were talking about after the Second World War and the establishment of the UN and rights-based discussions. We tolerate everything except intolerance, and it's incoherent. And I think people are starting to see that. I think as
Vatican
changed.
Sorry, I'm being rude. Forgive me.
No. I was only going to say that what's changed, as far as I can see as well, is the more from within we have a sense of what is right and behave appropriately, we need less tyranny from external force. We don't need the police, but the more we say, be free, freedom from constraint, do what you want, which is where we've got to, inevitably, because we don't have that inner, I suppose, check on our behavior, that conscience, we have to have a more tyrannical approach imposed from without. And so I think that's where we are. We've got this incoherence of a world that says, do what you want, don't worry about anything, and there's always a solution to the consequences. Have sex with who you want, take a pill to stop you getting pregnant, and if you do, have an abortion. There's everything. You're shielded from the consequences. I'm speaking as a Catholic now, very obviously, but and with that, what happens? You just have to have that external clampdown, and then I think it implodes. Then we see what we're seeing now.
Yes, I mean, I think I put it a little bit differently. It seems to me that there is a very considerable measure of truth in what you say, but I think we need to put other things into it. I think that one of the primary ways in which we avoid consequence is by excessive welfare. That what effectively we do, we say, however stupid your actions, somebody else will pick up the price. And it seems to me that the moment you remove the fact that actions have consequences,
yes,
you human beings are undone. That a world in which actions do not have consequences is one without any kind of meaning whatever.
Yeah.
And the fact that you can be as stupid as you want in some I mean, let's just take an example that most people will probably criticize me. People who engage in wildly dangerous sport and then just expect the NHS to pick them up and get injured. You are doing that without serious insurance is a scandalous. And that's what I mean by the fact that we've got ourselves into a system where actions have no consequences. Again, having children that you can't afford and just expecting that the state will pay for them. All of these things. So that's one side of it. But I think again, the shutting down of freedom of speech, I think it's much more the fact that we have elite opinions which are not generally shared. So, for example, the whole question isn't racial diversity wonderful? Well, we all know that sometimes it is, but very, very often it isn't. But the fact that it's effectively been unsayable. Some very interesting work has been done. The easiest way of accessing it is some of Neil Ferguson's writings. Neil has talked about the fact that in many ways, the West in general, and both Britain and America in particular, are rather like the late Soviet Union. Everybody in the late Soviet Union professed to believe in a workers' paradise, in the fact that they had the most just system and all the rest. Everybody knew it was a complete lie, but everybody pretended. The same way we have a public political culture, which is just a series of lies. And once again, this is going back to New Labour. New Labour begins this and entrenches it. And the erosions of freedom of speech, which again, you see the Starmer's first reaction to any problem is to try to shut people up. That's his second instinct is to lie, or you could occasionally dispute as to whether he lies first and tries to shut other people up second, or which other way, which forgive me, which other way around it is. And this again, this hollow shell of a disbelieved in public sphere is a catastrophe. I mean, the conversation has now come a complete circle, of course.
I think one of the things that I most admire, or love about the work that you're doing, is to put this pride back into our national identity, David. And like we're talking about the situation that we're looking at it from lots of different ways, but I think one of the solutions has to be, or one of the big problems is the fact that our institutions, particularly our universities, are teaching our young people to hate our culture, to hate our country, imperialism, and the worst.
All the things I talked about,
Exactly.
all those deliberate worms in the apple that the Soviets did from the 1950s onwards. Yeah.
But the UK is a great country with a great history, and we don't seem to be teaching it to our young people at all, do we?
In fact, we're doing the opposite. But you see, what is so dangerous is, as I was arguing before, as Disraeli argued, as Edmund Burke argued, we had a remarkably self-corrective system of politics. Again, you see, it's very difficult talking about some of the things that I'm doing. Things like words like the Constitution seem very abstract and highfalutin and all the rest of it. What I try to explain to people is not that a historical constitution is not like a kind of recipe book. Most people think of a constitution as a kind of recipe book, Labour Party rule book, rule 1, 3, 4, subsection A, B, small, superscript Roman 2 sort of thing. It's not. A constitution, the nearest thing to it is DNA. It's the kind of self-replicating thing that both replicates itself but also adjusts to changing circumstance. And that's what we've got to get people to understand. And it's because we've tried to start afresh from this extraordinary, what you're describing, Mark, think of it. Let me just introduce a new idea, because I think it's a very, very important one. If we go back right to the beginning of English culture, which is, remember, English is a very modern language. It's only really invented in the 14th century, particularly, it's astonishing, it's effectively invented by one man as a written language, Geoffrey Chaucer, in the late 1300s. And Chaucer's very widely traveled, been to Italy, met Petrarch, and all the rest of it, is fully aware of this extraordinary rediscovery of the Greek and Latin, the ancient world that's going on. And he writes this extraordinary couplet, quatrain, 4 lines, that explains it, translating it roughly into modern English. It is, just as each year out of the cold dead ground comes forth new corn, so from old books new science, new knowledge comes, old giving birth to new, a process of natural fertility. But what happened with Blair, what happened with Brown, you decided we didn't like that. So you literally swept the ground bare, uprooted everything, scattered salt on it, and then planted it again, and you're very surprised when it withers and dies. And again, it's the important thing is to understand the if you like, the we're not just talking about simple logic here. Yes, logic is reason, whatever, is vitally important, but we're talking about something organic. And what I'm beginning to sound like King Charles, and I apologize, but anyway. What Blair and Brown tried to do was to create, just like the French revolutionaries, that cold logic state, and it doesn't work. Doesn't work. You literally uproot. And you plant in barren soil. You don't water, and then you're surprised it dies. What better description could you give of where we find ourselves?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's so beautiful.
It is well put. Do you think we can recover, David? Like, when you stand back and look at Britain as a historian, do you see a country going through one of its, just a periodic unsettled phase, or is it permanent decline? Something more serious? A civilization has become estranged from its own inheritance in some way.
You never know. Remember, you can only understand history backwards. That if you want to be pretentious, it's Hegel, the owl of Minerva only flies at dusk. You can't. A historian isn't a prophet, and a historian who prophesies is fraud. But what you can do, you can see big patterns. And there's a very important recent article in, bizarrely, what is now, I think, the best commentary on our politics, which isn't the Conservative Spectator. It is, in theory, the leftish New Statesman. Anyway, there is a very important article by John Bew, historian, who was, I think, I can't remember whether he was our national security advisor or our foreign policy advisor in Downing Street. And what he says in that article is, we are now, this is answering specifically your point, we're at one of those stages where you need a fundamental reconstruction of government. And he compares it with the Napoleonic Wars, with the First World War, with the Second World War, and the Attlee administration, and to an extent with Margaret Thatcher. But what I think he failed to recognize, and I say this with due respect, because Bew has far more involvement with the actual processes of politics than I do. In the Napoleonic Wars, in the First World War, in the Second World War, even with Margaret Thatcher, even though Britain had effectively had a semi-socialist uniparty for nearly 40 years, the state was capable of reforming itself. The description that I've given of the Blairite state is not capable of doing anything. You see this extraordinary paradox. Starmer believes in this stuff. Starmer is the creation of all of this stuff, and he can do bugger all. And this is astonishing. I mean, this is. I mean, something like it has happened before. I mean, the mess we got ourselves into in the later 17th century was, in some ways, very, very similar to this, and we had the great good fortune to get ourselves out of it. But this is why this is why I push for the great repeal and restoration. It's many people say, oh, Starkey is just a historian. He was always interested in aristocracy and monarchy, wasn't he? This is just sentimental, backward-looking, nostalgic. It's not. What I'm arguing is that unless we undo what I call these bonds, at the moment, the British state is rather like Gulliver and Lilliput, tied down. Unless these bonds are struck off, we can't save ourselves. Now, is it going to be possible? I have no idea. But I do know one thing, Mark. I'm going to behave as though it is. I'm going to act as though it is. I'm going to try to campaign as though it is, because I wouldn't forgive myself otherwise. And what I'd like to end on is a simple point, which is, and I'm now saying this repeatedly and publicly, there is only one public virtue that matters, and it's called courage. Without courage, it doesn't matter how intelligent you are, how clever, how subtle, how brilliant a political operator. If you lack courage, it's worthless. So I know that in Christian doctrine, it's love or charity or whatever, but in public life, it's courage.
Yeah. A wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much, Dr. David Starkey, for joining us, I'm sure Mark will agree, what a wonderful conversation we've just had, and I'm sure it will be of value to many. And the rabbi you encountered invited you to pass over. I will extend an invitation if you were interested to come to the beautiful Missa Cantata sung Latin Mass I attend on Sundays. Get in touch with me if you'd like to come. It's really beautiful. In Clapham Park. So
Not
it's
a beautiful place, but
the invitation is accepted.
Oh, wonderful. So I'll be in touch with you, and it'll be great to have you join me there and my family. But for now, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that we'll have another conversation soon.
That would be a wonderful idea. Thank you both very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
thank you.